Alright, what's going on? This is an indie devlog for my game, The Promised Land. The Promised Land is a farming MMO, and it will be free to play. There will be paid assets, where 60% of revenue will be sent to groups fighting climate change and climate denial. That, however, will be a separate video log that you can see on my channel if you just go ahead and click there. This is strictly game stuff and development stuff. Alright, so let's get to it. I've been working on this game for about a year now. It's January 2020, and I started last year around January 15th in earnest with the code parts in 2019. Okay, so I've been a web developer for over 13 years. I saw pretty much the dominance of open source programming over enterprise programming tools rise and take place during that time. So that heavily influenced my decision making with the tools to use for this project. I ended up going with Godot, a game engine with some artificial intelligence and some self-awareness from its own title as well. It's really great. I wouldn't fully recommend it for 3D projects. It's very good, but getting there. It's had far more time being stable with 2D projects with pixel art style designs, so I feel confident in using it. However, I am using the mono distribution, which is still in purported alpha, but it's been working out well for me so far. For the back end, I found of a software called Nakama from a company called Heroic Labs. It is an open source real-time server for apps and games, and it is one of the best open source projects I've ever worked with. Everything that a online multiplayer game could need outside of running the actual game instance on the back end is provided. So that's login, chat rooms. Though you can't run a game instance quite yet, you still have real-time chat rooms, so you can manage your own communication, as I'll show in a little bit. And it uses Docker for scaling, which I'm familiar with as a web developer. So I do feel confident, given how it's set up, that this is something that I could get to scale, which is very unique to 2019 and 2020, that there's software available where just a few developers, in my case one, can hopefully, fingers crossed, get an MMO to scale, but we'll see that part. Right now, no one's playing it. Anyway, let's go into my development pattern, or what I got done over 2019, and I'll break everything down into quarters. So let's start out with Q1 2019. All right, the first thing I focused on in Q1 2019 was just the basic setup of getting login, etc. Working between Godot and Nakama. Everything you're seeing is the current build, but I'll work through everything as an example here. So you can see there's some avatars to pick from, and you start out on your own farm. After getting just the basic login and sign up, I really went straight to focusing on multiplayer immediate communication. So I'm calling it ephemeral data or game events. This is pretty much everything that you would need to communicate over a live WebSocket to tell people what you are doing in a real-time multiplayer game. To do collision detection and fancy things that you would see in a game like Overwatch, I would need to be able to run a game instance live in the back end. That is a bit undoable for me at the moment, but what you can see now is there is a way to communicate basic things like movement, as well as farming actions, as you'll see later. Also, you can just change your outfits, and it will reflect on both sides. So basically, all this is a little abstraction, which allows me to communicate data to a server and from a server, and translate things in real time. Okay, the next big thing is very similar. It's just saving data. So earlier we saw being able to communicate data quickly, but as you can see, when I load up a farm, it loads up with data, and then when you can see when I pick something up, it'll actually pick it up, and then if I reloaded the farm, it would show up with the new state where there's only 2 plants as opposed to 3. So what's going on there? We have another structure basically for saving data permanently to the server, or loading data from the server from the client. This is the save data file, and you can see the farm grid data it takes from the save data file, and we basically make different structures around data. The data is stored as JSON in the back end, and then it's translated into something else at runtime, basically this little C# object to make it understandable. At this point, early on, nothing is secure. I worked on that later in the year, as I'll talk about later. The other things that I did were basic kind of game development type things. Godot leans towards object-oriented programming, so I am setting up some very delicate OOP trees, so wish me luck if you're a computer programmer, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, this is my top level item object. There are different things like setting up scenes to set up things that you can walk behind, and you can see this in the game. So items are everything. That could be this lamp, it could be this house, it could be the plant. You can interact with some things, so you can see I can interact with this plant by picking it up. And then there are things which have areas that I can walk behind, as well as things that you can't see it, but there's a collider and there's a navigation element walking around it. So really basic kind of game setup stuff like that took place in the first quarter of 2019 as well. And then the last thing that took place in 2019, my game is going into night mode, so it's a little hard to see now, but it was just having a farm. So there's only one plant at the time, but I set up the ability to basically plant a seed in the ground and have it grow over a set amount of days. So that included a lot of systems. There's the time system, which is synced to the server. There's obviously a plant object, which is used to derive all the plants and stores all the information for their growth patterns. It is just a prototype showing off the really basic element, but again, one plant. All right, and that's pretty much what I did to wrap up the first quarter of 2019. So moving on, Q2 2019 was a lot of stuff that wasn't really in the game. Spent a good amount of time making a game launcher using Electron. I am largely a JavaScript developer, so this was somewhat comfortable to me. But basically, the only purpose of this is to download the game and update the game when I update it. It's somewhat unnecessary, but I do feel glad that I have it. It is something that I can build upon, as I'm probably going to eschew launching this on a traditional platform, but we'll see how that goes as well. The other big thing that I set up during this time period was a deployment system. So I can't really show it now, but well, I can show it sort of. Let's see. This is basically just a huge script that handles deploying this project, building and deploying it to the Google servers that handle the backend, as well as the Firebase website. By the way, there's a website. You can try this game right now, playthepromisedland.com. Anyway. And yeah, I set up this website as one of the earliest things, so you can download the game, and there's this stuff to figure out on here. So that was Q2 2019. A lot of really kind of boring stuff that wraps around a game, but gonna happen. All right, the other thing that I set up in Q2 2019 was just the whole idea of dungeon matchmaking. So you can see here we're in a town, and in the earlier example that I had, you could see that you could populate the town with other people playing multiplayer. Well, funny navigation there. But what happens when you do this? You are being match made, and that is what connects you to other people should they be there. So that whole apparatus of connecting to the server, finding if there are available matches, and putting yourself in the first available one, and there's no skill matching happening here. It's just the first 8 people get popped into a room together, basically. But I digress. That whole setup happens then, and it's actually really important because that's kind of a base way the game's going to work. I haven't decided if I want to move away from that. Right now, every individual scene will or can act as its own multiplayer match and connect people together to play and stuff like that. But do I maybe want to stitch together scenes into the idea of being in a town? Here's another scene, by the way. Or do I want to make every jump basically its own thing, like what's going to feel better. You might feel disconnected if you're in town and you see a certain set of people, then you walk out and you see some other people, but those are all things to figure out. Basically, in Q2 2019, I figured out the very basics of using Nakama to connect and make a little match. So at this point in Q2 2019, I had some money saved up, not that much. If I really wanted to take a go with the amount of content that I had then, I would have needed to crowdfund. I tried to do a little bit of marketing, although that's not really my thing. And I figured if I wanted to make this a thing, I'd be better off going back to seeking work as a contract web developer, so I can be pretty flexible, taking a few contracts, then coming back, and as well as working on my free time. So took a deep breath, and I went back to finding web development gigs in Q2 2019. Anyway, so I did do some small things during that time that had to pertain to the game. So I set up a whole dialogue system. So if you walk to a character, although this character Sakana wasn't set up or existing then, you can see that there is a dialogue that pops up, and certain characters, one character that did exist was Computer House, who you can buy seeds from. You can walk up to and talk to, and there will be a tree, as well as the possibility of purchasing and selling things, which I developed a little bit later. But basically, I set up a dialogue system which can also be internationalized. So you can see here, everyone's dialogue is broken up into an individual file, which can be modded later, I'm sure. But the main purpose is to hopefully, if I can get this game going, to then have it offered in as many languages as possible by getting them translated through flat files. I've seen online some game developers streaming and putting in dialogue straight into the programming code. And I, as a web developer, I've done that, and then I've had to do the process of internationalizing it afterwards, and it's a huge pain when you very early on intermingle just the notion of language in your programming code, which is really weird. So this might seem like over optimization, and in some ways it is, but I'm very happy to have set it up at this time. So that's something I'm doing while I'm working on contracting gigs. The other thing that I do is basically make the farm less hackable by sending all database transactional information every time you farm something, sending that to the server, as opposed to just trusting the client with the big file of JSON as to what the farm should be. As a web developer, you never trust a client. As a game developer, you shouldn't trust a client either. So this is just a way to say, instead of giving me your entire farm data and saving it as is, and therefore trusting you with every little bit of that, why don't you tell me where you want to harvest a plant? And then I'll make sure that there is a plant there that you can harvest, and then remove it for you and everything. Same thing with tilling soil. Why don't you tell me where you want to till it, and then I'll make sure if you actually can. This is just some basic kind of security around making sure that you can't hack the game too easily. That wrapped up Q2 2019. So I have a good base of the game, multiplayer communication, saving things to the back end, and some good abstractions to represent all this stuff. I have a deployment pipeline, as well as a website and a game launcher to handle updates as well. So really good core infrastructure setup, and I'm still working paid gigs at this moment in Q3 2019. So development was still a little bit slow then. The next big thing that I did was just initial shader research. I'm, again, a web developer. I haven't really spent too much time with game development, maybe about a year and a half, 2 years at this point, in 2019. So this was my first major experience with shaders. And if anyone's actually experienced shaders, you're gonna laugh and remember how your first beer tasted, etc. But basically, I just delved into rather simple and imperfect color replacement. And this is the start, the very root of what will develop into a system where you can customize your avatar using different clothing and different hairstyles, as well as having color palettes to customize those clothes and hairstyles further. This is basically very similar to a Warframe, if you're familiar, if maybe a little less detailed. So that was fun to set up in Q3 2019. The other big thing was the initial idea of a currency. So I did not have money set up until that point either. So I thought a little bit about how I wanted to handle that. And one of the big problems you see with MMOs and economies and maybe general is hyperinflation. But with MMOs they incur because if you can, for example, in Diablo just kill a monster and generate coins, you could just sit there printing money. Like, just kill the monster, print money. It makes no sense. Anyway, so how I came up with this economy is far more in line with that, actually. Anyway, you have one currency, the silver currency, that you will use to purchase things that would be necessary to grow plants and maybe further other things. You will also be able to get that same currency for providing said plants. So you can see I grew some potatoes and grew some eggplants. Now I'm selling them and I'm getting that currency. Here's where it's different. The initial currency, the silver currency, which you use for things that you would farm with, is capped at 100 currently, after which you would then start getting gold coins. So the idea is you do your part a little bit and then you get the gold coins, which are an unregulated, uncapped currency, which would pay for things like clothing and customizations and stuff like that. I'm not sticking with this totally. I don't know how it'll work functionally with actual people in a real game, but we'll find out together, yeah? Anyway, I think that's kind of a unique concept to the game. I did come up with it largely to try to figure out how I can avoid hyperinflation, although it ends up being more of a story dynamic than anything else. But we'll see how that plays out. Anyway, that was the other thing that I did in Q3 2019, was basically set up a wallet in the back end to handle all point of sale transactions, and as well as handling when to trigger amount transfers, with the greed probably not better than this limit constant, currently set to 100. All right, the other thing that I set in Q3 2019, which is kind of obvious right now, is the day-night cycle. There weren't light objects quite yet, but just the initial idea of having a visual representation of the fact that it was evening. You'll also see after some time some sun rays and stuff, which work better in some areas than other, and you'll see long shadows, which I think are cool. I should probably wait till you see those long shadows. Maybe not. Alright, so let's talk about Q4 2019. Just getting off a hiatus from work. I wrapped up some contracts and I'm living off ramen noodles, so I'm able to keep that money burning for me, at least for the rest of the quarter, which I just went through. I was pretty burnt out, I gotta say, but I did get a lot done. The biggest thing was working with Maven. All the art you see now here is produced by Maven. They're the excellent pixel artist who is handling all of the art that you see in the game. I largely just sent some references of what the characters would do in society, and they were awesome enough to provide just avatars, as well as like some background relationships and stuff like that, which you'll see throughout the game. So at this point now we have consistent art coming in for everything, which is really exciting, and you really start to see like a kind of style develop over this time. So that was the start of Q4 2019 in October, and which was awesome, and I hope to really bring this game alive using Maven's art. So through that art, we created this town, put together different things, different characters. So it is the start of a style I want to kind of push, not an overly rural style, although this is a farming game. Just to kind of push the idea of really having more of a mixed environment in terms of suburban, urban, and rural living. I don't think there's any reason they should be as separated as they are. Anyway. Alright, the other big thing that got done in Q4 2019 was starting the feature that I was kind of excited for, which is just a community farm. Essentially, it's a shared area where the design is certainly pending. I'm not sure if this moat thing with the cones are going to last, but basically you get a farm that you can kind of load into a multiplayer area, and everyone will kind of have an area to show off different things. Right now everything's pretty basic. Obviously it's the same farm features as you're used to with just about 6 or so plants, and you have a way to buy seeds right here. But I hope to build this out, and as we have different things to put on your farm, areas like scarecrows, flowers, etc., I can kind of think this is a cool place to just demonstrate and show off and meet other people too. And we'll figure out different ways to make it feel like a community farm in terms of missions, etc. as well. Okay, and the last thing I got done in Q4 2019 was setting up navigation. So there are a lot of collidable objects that you can walk around, and earlier you would just kind of walk into them. So it took some time to set up nav meshing, which Godot supports pretty well. I had to set up a little bit of data to custom bake my own nav mesh at runtime, which I prefer to do because eventually I'm going to have dynamic collidable objects. But this is kind of more or less of a convenience thing, so it'll be less people running into each other, as well as better reconciliation on the multiplayer end of where people should navigate to based on the coordinates you receive. So yeah, that was good. And that was the end of Q4 2019. So it's January 4th, 2020. I'm hoping to get a whole bunch done in Q1 2020. Will I get all of it done? Probably not, but I'm aiming to try to get custom outfits done. So working with Maven to make different outfits that you could kind of trade off between the players, different hairstyles, etc. So your avatar can be even more customized than we see right now. After that, I need to have some kind of fishing game, right? It's not a game without a fishing minigame. And then the last thing after that, which would be the biggest thing, would be crafting. So going out there, chopping some wood, hitting those rocks, getting some minerals, and then turning them into this stuff using, I'm thinking, a blueprint system. And since this is more of a future utopia kind of idea, a kind of re-atomizer thing. Anyway, we'll talk about it. I'll be making more of these video log updates as the year goes by. They'll probably be a little bit shorter considerably, because it won't take a whole year to make them. All right, take care everyone.